Number 1. Toshemie Wilson, the Mississippi teacher sentenced to 192 years for grooming students over a decade. Toshemie Wilson was a teacher and student group advisor at Amory High School in Monroe County, Mississippi. And what he did to the young people placed in his care over a period of nearly a decade stands as one of the most extensively prosecuted cases of educator exploitation in the history of the American federal court system. Wilson used his official position as advisor to the Technology Students of America, a school-sanctioned student group, that gave him legitimate and trusted access to students during school hours on school property and during out-of-town trips for academic competitions to identify, target, and systematically groom vulnerable young male students beginning as early as 2005. The grooming process Wilson employed was methodical and calculated. He would build trust with selected students over time, normalize his relationship with them to a degree that made them dependent on his approval, and then leverage that emotional dependency to coerce them into producing sexually explicit videos and photographs in exchange for money or drugs. The locations Wilson chose for this exploitation were deliberately selected to reduce the risk of discovery. The school bathroom during school hours, an office space he rented separately for the specific purpose of having students produce material there, and the bathroom of a local Walmart. Several victims later testified in federal court that Wilson had directed them to produce material while they were on out-of-town school trips with the Technology Students of America, using the cover of an academic competition to conduct crimes in hotel rooms and other locations far from the scrutiny of the Amory community. The investigation into Wilson began when one former student, having carried the burden of what had happened for years, finally reported the abuse to a school counselor. That counselor fulfilled the legal obligation to report the statement to law enforcement, and the case was referred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Mississippi Attorney General's office, both of whom conducted the investigation jointly as part of Project Safe Childhood, a nationwide Department of Justice initiative targeting child sexual exploitation. Over the course of the investigation, at least 11 students reported abuse to investigators. In December 2023, a federal jury in Greenville, Mississippi, found Wilson guilty on 8 separate counts of sexual exploitation of children, each count corresponding to documented instances of his conduct during his tenure in the Amory School District. On May 29, 2024, a federal judge sentenced Toshemie Wilson to 192 years in federal prison, with each of the 8 counts carrying a 24-year sentence. He was additionally ordered to pay $123,353.34 in restitution to the victims of his crimes, plus a $5,000 trafficking assessment. In April 2026, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit affirmed Wilson's conviction and sentence, rejecting his challenge to the sufficiency of the evidence. The state charges Wilson had also faced, including human trafficking and procurement of sexual servitude of a minor, were subsequently dismissed at the request of the Mississippi Attorney General's office, citing victim reluctance to proceed through a second criminal process given the federal sentence already in place. Wilson's victims, the young men who sat in his classroom and trusted him with their futures, had already given testimony of extraordinary courage. United States Attorney Clay Joyner said at the time of sentencing that parents and children should be able to trust teachers, and that Wilson had profoundly betrayed that trust and deserved every hour of every day he would spend in prison. The 192-year sentence ensured he would. Number 2. Nicholas Clark, the Virginia 5th grade teacher arrested at his own school on child pornography charges in 2026. Nicholas Joseph Clark was 29 years old and employed as a 5th grade teacher at Woodbrook Elementary School in Albemarle County, Virginia, when he was arrested on the morning of March 2, 2026, on 2 felony charges of possessing and distributing child pornography. The arrest took place at the school itself, though investigators made certain that Clark was not taken into custody in the presence of students. The investigation that led to his arrest began not through any behavioral concern raised by school staff or parents, but through a cyber tip submitted to the Internet Crimes Against Children task force, the same federal state law enforcement mechanism that has become one of the primary tools for detecting child sexual abuse material being accessed and distributed online. The tip identified digital activity connected to Clark's home internet account, leading investigators to subpoena Comcast Cable for the subscriber information associated with the IP address involved. That subpoena linked the activity directly to Clark. On February 26, 2026, investigators obtained a search warrant for Clark's residence on Reservoir Ridge Road in Charlottesville, Virginia. The warrant was executed on the morning of March 2, the same morning Clark reported to Woodbrook Elementary for what would be his final day as a teacher. Officers seized a tablet and 2 laptops from his home. According to search warrant documents obtained by local news organizations, investigators found that Clark had uploaded 2 pornographic videos and 12 images that appeared to depict an underage girl. Investigators stated publicly that they did not believe Clark was involved in the production of the material himself, but the possession and distribution charges under Virginia law are felonies regardless of the production question. At a bond hearing on March 12, 2026, Albemarle County General District Court Judge Matthew Quattrara denied Clark's request to be released to the custody of his mother and stepfather on home electronic incarceration. The judge cited 2 prior incidents that had occurred before the alleged crimes, including a separate instance in which Clark had messaged and sent nude photographs to a person he believed to be a 15-year-old on the platform Discord, a person who turned out to be an adult located overseas, who subsequently blackmailed Clark by threatening to report his behavior to the school. The judge characterized these incidents as near misses that should have prompted self-intervention and described Clark's behavioral pattern as that of an addict. Clark admitted guilt when first questioned by detectives following his arrest and was described as cooperative with the ongoing investigation. Woodbrook Elementary School Principal Christy Isaiah notified all school families on the day of the arrest. Albemarle County Public Schools Superintendent Dr. Matthew Haas confirmed that Clark had completed all required background checks prior to employment, including a Virginia State Police criminal history check and a search of the Central Registry for Child Abuse and Neglect, and that nothing in those checks had identified the risk that was subsequently uncovered. Clark's case was pending further court proceedings as of April 2026, with a preliminary hearing scheduled for April 23. For the families of Woodbrook Elementary students who had trusted Clark with their children's education and daily safety, the arrest raised the question that haunts every similar case. How long and how close to the children they love had the danger been? Number 3. Matthew Huck, the Ohio wrestling coach who pressured teenage boys to have sex with his wife over 13 years. Matthew Huck was the wrestling coach at River Valley High School in Gallia County, Ohio, and the case that prosecutors eventually built against him and his then-wife Mickle Page Huck is one of the most deeply disturbing examples of how 2 adults in positions of authority can collaborate over more than a decade to systematically abuse the young people placed in their care. The crimes committed by the Hucks did not follow the pattern most commonly associated with educator sexual abuse, in which a single predator exploits a single victim. Instead, the Hucks developed a shared sexual fantasy that they acted upon repeatedly over a period investigators determined stretched from 2003 to 2016. By targeting teenage boys from the River Valley High School wrestling team and pressuring them to engage in sexual acts with Paige Huck, while Matthew, as their coach, used his authority over their athletic careers and their place on the team to facilitate the abuse. The psychological dynamic created by Matthew Huck's position as wrestling coach was central to what made the crimes possible and what made them continue for so long without detection. These were boys who had worked hard to earn a place on the team, who valued their athletic standing, and who depended on their coach's goodwill and continued mentorship for their participation in a sport they cared about deeply. The exploitation of that dependency, the implicit and sometimes explicit use of Matthew Huck's power over their team membership to pressure compliance, was identified by the special prosecutor in the case as one of the most disturbing elements of the offense. Paige Huck was arrested first, in August 2023, and charged with 6-degree felony counts of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. Matthew Huck faced his own separate criminal proceedings. In January 2025, Matthew Huck was convicted of 4 felony offenses and sentenced to 6 years in prison. He was additionally designated as a sex offender required to register for 25 years following his release from custody. Special Prosecutor David Kelly stated at the time of sentencing that the evidence revealed Matthew Huck had also separately sexually assaulted a teenage girl at a co-ed sleepover at the Huck home in 2004, a victim who came forward after learning of the charges against Paige Huck and whose testimony, Kelly said, cemented the case against Matthew. The Hucks had divorced by the time their respective criminal cases were resolved. The crimes in the case dated back to 2003, meaning that for 13 years, the students who went through River Valley High School's wrestling program were exposed to a predator operating in plain sight with the full institutional authority of a coaching position. A civil lawsuit filed by a Columbus law firm in federal court documented the scope of the abuse in detail that no criminal sentence could fully capture. Number 4. Danielle Watkins, the South Carolina teacher who sent explicit images to a 15-year-old student she met in her classroom. Danielle Watkins was a teacher at Chapin High School in Lexington County, South Carolina, when she entered into an inappropriate relationship with a 15-year-old male student that law enforcement described as a textbook example of how digital communication technology has transformed the landscape of teacher-on-student exploitation. Watkins used her smartphone to send the student explicit photographs and to engage in sexually explicit text conversations that investigators later retrieved from digital records and introduced as evidence in the criminal proceedings against her. The relationship was discovered when the student's parents became aware of the communications and reported them to law enforcement. The investigation was handled by the Lexington County Sheriff's Department, which executed search warrants on electronic devices and obtained the full record of the communications between Watkins and her student. The evidence presented in court detailed the explicit nature of the messages and photographs, exchanged the context in which the relationship had developed from a standard classroom dynamic into something that was both illegal and profoundly damaging to the student, and the degree to which Watkins had used her position of authority and the access it gave her to deliberately pursue the relationship. She was charged with criminal sexual conduct with a minor and disseminating obscene material to a minor, among other charges. She entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to prison, followed by a period of probation. She was placed on the sex offender registry and permanently lost her teaching certification. The case attracted significant media attention in South Carolina, partly because of Watkins' appearance, which prompted the kind of social media commentary that mental health professionals and victim advocates have consistently identified as deeply harmful to the process of recognizing teacher-student abuse for what it legally and psychologically is. The social narrative that frames female teachers who abuse male students as somehow less serious than the reverse has been documented to affect reporting rates, law enforcement, responses, prosecutorial decisions, sentencing, and the long-term psychological outcomes for male victims who internalize those social messages and struggle to identify their own experience as abuse. The student in the Watkins case, like many male victims of female teacher abuse, had to navigate that specific social complexity while simultaneously processing what had actually happened to him and beginning the long process of understanding its impact on his life. Number 5. James Krosinek Sr. The New York case where the connection to a school community made a cold case murder even more devastating. The murder of Kathleen Krosinek in Brighton, New York, on the morning of February 19, 1982, was one of the longest-running cold cases in Monroe County history, and when it was finally solved nearly 4 decades later, the resolution devastated a community that had spent years not knowing what had happened and had in some ways continued to move through life with the assumption that justice might never arrive. Kathleen was found by her daughter, who was a young child at the time, having been struck in the head with an axe while she slept. Her husband, James Krosinek, who was at the time employed in a professional capacity and deeply embedded in the social fabric of the Rochester area community, was identified almost immediately by investigators as the most likely suspect. He had, investigators believed, returned to the family home after Kathleen was asleep, killed her with an axe, hidden the weapon, and left for work as though nothing had occurred. But in 1982, the physical evidence available was insufficient to support a prosecution. The case remained open for 38 years. In that time, James Krosinek rebuilt his life, remarried, and continued to live in the Rochester area. He was never far from the orbit of investigators who believed they knew what had happened but could not prove it in a courtroom. In 2020, a Monroe County grand jury indicted James Krosinek on charges of second-degree murder. The case that prosecutors built relied on physical evidence that had been preserved from the 1982 scene and re-examined using forensic techniques that had not been available at the time of the original investigation, as well as circumstantial evidence documenting the state of the Krosinek marriage, James's financial motivations, and the absence of any plausible alternative perpetrator. He was convicted of second-degree murder in September 2022 and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He was 70 years old at sentencing. His daughter, who had been the one to find her mother's body when she was a small child, attended the trial as an adult and sat through proceedings that required her to confront the full facts of what had happened in her home that morning and who had been responsible. The case is documented in detail in Monroe County court records and was covered extensively by the Democrat and Chronicle. The 40 years during which Kathleen's killer lived freely while her family carried the weight of an unsolved murder represent one of the most painful aspects of a case that was eventually resolved, but only after a price was paid in time and grief that can never be recovered. Number 6. Mary Kay Letourneau, the Seattle elementary school teacher who raped her 12-year-old student and then married him. Mary Kay Letourneau was 34 years old, married, a mother of 4 children, and a 6th-grade teacher at Shorewood Elementary School in Burien, a suburb south of Seattle, Washington, when she began a sexual relationship in June 1996 with Vili Fualau, a 12-year-old boy who was her student. Letourneau had first encountered Fualau years earlier when he was a 2nd grader in her classroom, and she had noticed his artistic abilities. By the time he entered her 6th grade class in the fall of 1995, the dynamic between the adult teacher and the child had been developing for years under the legitimizing cover of a teacher-student mentorship. What happened in June 1996 was not a mentorship. It was a crime. Linder-Creo was discovered by Seattle police officers in a minivan parked at the Des Moines Marina at approximately 1:20 in the morning on June 19, 1996, with fuel. When officers questioned her, she told them the boy was 18 years old. He was 12. The police released them both and took no further action at that time. By September of 1996, Linder-Creo was pregnant with Fuel's child. In February 1997, her husband Steve Linder-Creo discovered love letters Mary had written to Fuel, and a relative of his contacted the police. Linder-Creo was arrested on March 4, 1997, and charged with second-degree child rape. In May 1997, while awaiting sentencing, she gave birth to a daughter fathered by Fuel. Linder-Creo entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of second-degree child rape. The state sought a sentence of 7.5 years in prison, but King County Superior Court Judge Linder-Creo showed leniency, suspending all but 6 months of the sentence on condition that Linder-Creo enter a sex offender treatment program and have absolutely no further contact with Fuel. Linder-Creo was released from jail in January 1998, having served 3 months. On February 3, 1998, Seattle police officers found Linder-Creo in a parked car with Fuel. She was arrested immediately. Investigators found a large amount of cash, passports, and baby clothing in the vehicle, indicating the pair may have been planning to flee. 3 days later, on February 6, Judge Lau reinstated the suspended sentence in full, and Linder-Creo was sent to prison for 7.5 years at the Washington Corrections Center for Women. While serving that sentence, in October 1998, she gave birth to a second daughter by Fuel. The 2 children were raised by Fuel's mother while Linder-Creo remained imprisoned. Linder-Creo was released from prison in August 2004. In August 2005, she and Fuel, then 22 years old to her 43, married at a winery in Woodinville, Washington. They remained married for 14 years and divorced in 2019. Linder-Creo died on July 6, 2020, at the age of 58 from colon cancer at her home near Seattle, with Fuel by her side. Throughout the years following her release and her marriage, Linder-Creo frequently spoke publicly about the relationship, and the media coverage of the case often framed it in the language of romance rather than crime. Mental health professionals and victim advocacy organizations have consistently argued that this framing caused serious harm to public understanding of child sexual abuse, to the broader cultural recognition of male victimization by female authority figures, and to Fuel himself, whose struggle with substance abuse and depression in the years following the case was documented by journalists who covered him as he grew into adulthood. The Linder-Creo case is documented in full through King County Superior Court records and has been the subject of multiple documentaries and news investigations. Number 7. Dennis Hastert, the Speaker of the House who had been a high school wrestling coach when he abused his students. Dennis Hastert served as the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives from 1999 to 2007, making him at his peak the 3rd most powerful person in the American government, directly behind the Vice President and the President himself. Before he was a congressman, before he was a political figure of any kind, Hastert was a wrestling coach and teacher at Yorkville High School in Kendall County, Illinois. And it was in that role in the 1960s and 1970s that he committed the crimes that would eventually destroy his reputation, end his freedom, and permanently reframe his entire public life as a grotesque exercise in the gap between political image and private reality. Hastert abused multiple male students during his time as their coach and teacher, using the physical access provided by his role. The authority he held over young athletes who were invested in their sport, and the specific psychological vulnerability of adolescent boys who trusted and looked up to the man responsible for their athletic development. His victims remained silent for decades, carrying their experiences through their adult lives, while Hastert went on to build one of the most prominent political careers in the history of Illinois and the nation. The crimes themselves were beyond the statute of limitations by the time investigators became aware of them, meaning Hastert could not be charged directly with the sexual abuse. He was instead charged and eventually convicted in 2015 of federal banking violations related to the elaborate system of cash withdrawals he had used to make hush money payments to at least one of his victims, a man identified in court documents as Individual A, who had confronted Hastert about the abuse years earlier. Hastert had agreed to pay Individual a $3.5 million to keep the abuse secret. He had withdrawn the cash in amounts designed to stay below the federal reporting threshold of $10,000, a crime known as structuring. When federal investigators began investigating the cash withdrawals, the hush money payments were uncovered and the reason for them was exposed. Hastert was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison and 2 years of supervised release. At sentencing, federal Judge Thomas Durkin told Hastert that he was, in the judge's words, a serial child molester, and that the case was more disturbing than most because of the position of trust Hastert had occupied in both his educational and his political career. Several of Hastert's former students came forward publicly after the sentencing to describe their own experiences. One, a man named Scott Cross, whose brother Tom served in the Illinois state legislature alongside Hastert, publicly identified himself as another victim. Individual A, identified later as Steve Rienbold, had died of AIDS in 1995 and was not alive to see Hastert's conviction. Rienbold's sister Jeline gave a victim impact statement at sentencing describing what her brother had told her about what Hastert had done to him and the lifelong impact it had carried. Hastert was released from federal prison in 2017. He died on April 26, 2023. The story of Dennis Hastert is unique in the annals of teacher misconduct cases, not because of what he did in the gymnasium at Yorkville High School, which follows the same pattern as so many other coach abuse cases, but because of what came afterward, the uninterrupted construction of a public life built entirely on the foundation of secrets that were kept by victims and by the perpetrator for more than half a century. Number 8. Joseph DiPuglio, the New Jersey teacher who sexually abused a female student for 2 years and was not arrested until he was 76. Joseph DiPuglio taught at Steinert High School in Hamilton Township, New Jersey for 40 years before retiring in 2008. And for 2 of those years between 1998 and 2000, he engaged in a sexual relationship with one of his female students, meeting her at his home in Ewing Township while she was enrolled at the school, and while he held supervisory and disciplinary authority over her as her teacher. The student did not report what had happened at the time. She carried it for more than 2 decades, through her adolescence, through her education, through her adult life, before she finally went to the Ewing Police Department at the end of 2022 and told them what DiPuglio had done to her when she was in his class. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Mercer County Prosecutor's Special Victims Unit in partnership with the Ewing Police Department. Under New Jersey law, there is no statute of limitations for sexual assault cases, meaning the passage of 22 years since the abuse had occurred did not bar prosecution. On March 27, 2023, DiPuglio was arrested at the age of 76 and charged with 1 count of second-degree sexual assault and 1 count of second-degree endangering the welfare of a child. The case proceeded through the Mercer County court system. DiPuglio ultimately entered a guilty plea to 1 count of second-degree child endangerment. As a condition of his plea agreement, he was required to give up his teaching credentials, which was formalized through the New Jersey State Board of Examiners. He was additionally prohibited from holding any public sector job. The plea agreement allowed DiPuglio to enter a pretrial intervention program, a mechanism available under New Jersey law to first-time criminal offenders, which can result in expungement of the record upon successful completion if the individual remains out of trouble for the duration of the program. Mercer County prosecutor Angelo Onofre confirmed the details of the case and the outcome of the proceedings. For the woman who had been his student, who had spent 22 years carrying what DiPuglio had done before finding the strength to walk into a police station and report it. The question of what the legal outcome meant in terms of justice is one that no court outcome can fully resolve. The case is documented through the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office records and was reported by multiple New Jersey news organizations. DiPuglio had spent 40 years as a teacher in the New Jersey public school system. His victim had spent more than half those 40 years deciding whether to tell anyone what had happened to her in his home. Number 9. Anthony Linder-Creo, the New Jersey teacher and coach fired one day before his arrest for sexually assaulting a 17-year-old student. Anthony Linder-Creo was 24 years old when he was arrested on September 8, 2022, on 4 counts of second-degree sexual assault and 1 count of second-degree endangering the welfare of a child. He had been employed as a business teacher and multi-sport assistant coach at Steinert High School in Hamilton Township, New Jersey, the same school where, separately, another teacher named Joseph DiPuglio would later be charged with abusing a student 20 years prior. Linder-Creo had been hired at Steinert in March 2020 and had been working simultaneously as an assistant coach for the school's football and basketball teams. The investigation into Linder-Creo was conducted by the Mercer County Prosecutor's Special Victims Unit after allegations emerged that he had engaged in sexual relations with a 17-year-old female student at his home in Robbinsville, New Jersey, in August 2022. The Hamilton Township School District terminated Linder-Creo the day before he was arrested, a sequence of events that underscored the speed with which the institution moved to separate him from the school once the investigation became known, and simultaneously the proximity of the timeline to the arrest itself. Linder-Creo was held in the Mercer County Correction Center pending a detention hearing following his arrest. The Mercer County Prosecutor's Office made the arrest public immediately. The case subsequently proceeded through the pretrial intervention program after Linder-Creo was accepted into it in September 2022, a mechanism available under New Jersey law to first-time criminal offenders that allows them to avoid a conviction on their record if they remain out of trouble for the duration of the program. As one of the conditions of his entry into the program, Linder-Creo formally relinquished his teaching certificate to the New Jersey State Board of Examiners at its January 2023 meeting. He was additionally required to have no further contact with the victim and to undergo psychological evaluation and comply with any recommended treatment. The case highlighted a dimension of teacher misconduct that is often less examined than the crimes of career predators with decades of abuse behind them. The teacher who had been in the profession for fewer than 3 years, who used a coaching role to supplement his access to students, and who was arrested at an age young enough that his own distance from the student's age was measured in just a few years. Linder-Creo was 24. His victim was 17. The abuse of authority that makes such a case criminal does not require a vast difference in age. It requires only the existence of institutional power and the decision to exploit it. Number 10. Jerry Sandusky, the Penn State defensive coordinator who used a children's charity to access and abuse dozens of boys over 15 years. Gerald Arthur Sandusky, known universally as Jerry Sandusky, spent 32 years as an assistant football coach at Pennsylvania State University, serving as defensive coordinator under head coach Joe Paterno from 1969 until his retirement from coaching in 1999. During those 3 decades, Sandusky built a national reputation as one of the most accomplished defensive minds in college football, and was widely regarded as a beloved mentor to student athletes and a dedicated philanthropist who had founded with his wife Dottie a nonprofit organization called the Second Mile in 1977. The Second Mile was established ostensibly to provide programming and support for at-risk youth in Pennsylvania, and it was through the Second Mile that Sandusky systematically identified, groomed, and sexually abused dozens of boys over a period that investigators later determined stretched from the mid-1980s through 2008. More than 15 years of documented predation conducted under the institutional cover of a celebrated charity and a revered coaching career. Sandusky's method was deliberate and thorough. Through the Second Mile, he gained access to boys who were among the most vulnerable in Pennsylvania, children from troubled homes, children without strong father figures, children who were specifically drawn to the mentorship and attention he offered. He cultivated relationships with these boys and their families over time, presenting himself as an extraordinarily generous benefactor, taking them to Penn State football games and practices, buying them gifts, giving them access to the Penn State athletic facilities, including the locker rooms and showers that would later figure centrally in the criminal investigation. He used the prestige and the resources of his university position to build a level of trust that made his eventual abuse of that trust catastrophic. The investigation into Sandusky began formally in 2008 when the mother of a boy identified in court documents as Victim 1 reported concerns to her son's school. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office opened an investigation. In November 2011, Sandusky was indicted on 52 counts of child sexual abuse involving 10 identified victims. The grand jury presentment that accompanied the indictment included detailed descriptions of incidents spanning from the mid-1980s through 2008, and included an account from a former Penn State graduate assistant named Mike McQuarrie, who testified that he had witnessed Sandusky sexually abusing a boy in the Penn State locker room showers in 2001 and had reported what he saw to Joe Paterno. The revelations triggered one of the most significant institutional crises in the history of American higher education. Joe Paterno, Penn State President Graham Spanier, and other senior university officials were accused of having known about allegations against Sandusky and having failed to report them to law enforcement. Paterno died of lung cancer in January 2012, before the criminal proceedings were complete. Spanier was eventually convicted of child endangerment in 2017. On June 22, 2012, after a trial during which multiple victims testified in open court about what Sandusky had done to them, a Centre County jury convicted Jerry Sandusky of 45 of the 48 counts with which he had been charged, making him guilty on 45 counts of child sexual abuse involving 10 victims. Judge John Cleland sentenced him to a minimum of 30 and a maximum of 60 years in state prison, a sentence that, given Sandusky's age at the time of sentencing, effectively meant the remainder of his natural life behind bars. As of 2026, Sandusky, in his late 70s, remains incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Laurel Highlands in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. His appeals, including arguments about the conduct of the trial and the sufficiency of the evidence, have been rejected at every level of the appellate process. The victims of Jerry Sandusky, identified in the trial record as Victim 1 through Victim 10, are now adults. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences and the impact of the abuse on their lives. Others have maintained their privacy. What is documented beyond any challenge in the official record of Centre County Common Pleas Court is that for more than 15 years a man who was celebrated nationally as a mentor, a philanthropist, and one of college football's great coaches, was using the institutions built around him to destroy the childhoods of the boys who had been sent to him for help.